The cold, grey sky over northern Germany was split open by the distant rumble of aircraft engines, a sound that had become painfully familiar to every pilot serving in the Luftwaffe by late 1943. Among those pilots was Heinz Knoke, a young fighter ace who had risen quickly through the ranks, not because of privilege or protection, but because he had survived long enough to learn the deadly rhythm of aerial combat. On that particular morning, as he climbed into the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, he could sense the tension in the air long before he saw anything on the horizon. The ground crews moved with mechanical precision, their faces pale, their motions hurried. They already knew what Heinz would soon see for himself. The American bombers were coming again. Knoke had watched the war transform around him. When he first joined the Luftwaffe, the skies over Europe had still belonged to Germany. The early months of the war had been marked by swift victories and a belief that the Reich's Air Force was nearly unstoppable. But things had changed, slowly at first, and then all at once. By the time Heinz took his place as a seasoned fighter ace, the American 8th Air Force had begun sending wave after wave of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators across the continent. These were not small formations that could be harassed and broken apart. These were massive steel armadas stretching miles across the sky, bristling with guns and escorted by long-range fighters that seemed to multiply every month. On this day, as Heinz lifted off the runway and banked into the cold morning air, he could already feel the vibrations of distant engines traveling through the atmosphere. He switched to the tactical frequency, listening as unit leaders tried to keep their voices steady. They reported the incoming formation. Hundreds of American bombers flying in tight combat boxes, heading directly toward key industrial targets deep inside Germany. The scale of the attack was unlike anything he had faced in the war's early years. Even before making visual contact, he knew what this meant. The Americans were no longer testing defenses. They were overwhelming them. Climbing steadily, Heinz's Bf 109 cut through the clouds as he scanned the horizon. Then, slowly, like a dark stain spreading across the sky, the bomber formations began to emerge. At first, it was only a cluster of dots, barely visible, but with each passing second, the dots grew, merged, and solidified into the unmistakable shape of hundreds of heavy bombers flying in perfect discipline. It looked less like aircraft approaching and more like a moving wall of metal. By now, he had seen enough large formations to understand what lay ahead. But this, he would later recall, was different. This was a scale of power that no Luftwaffe pilot had ever trained to face. Even the sun itself seemed dimmed by the shadow of the approaching armada. The bombers were arranged in their deadly combat boxes, overlapping fields of fire, weaving a protective cage around the formation. Each B-17 carried up to 13 heavy machine guns. Each B-24 carried nearly as many. From a distance, their guns sparkled faintly in the pale light. Up close, Heinz knew those sparkles would turn into a storm of tracers that filled the sky. Every aircraft in the formation protected the others, and an attacking German fighter had only seconds to approach, fire, and pull away before being cut apart by a torrent of .50 caliber rounds. But the guns were only part of the problem. For months now, Heinz and the rest of the Luftwaffe had been forced to deal with something else. Long-range escorts. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning had been difficult enough. They were fast, heavily armed, and flown by pilots who had quickly grown more confident and experienced. But by late 1943, a new aircraft had begun appearing at high altitude, sleek, powerful, and capable of flying farther than any American fighter before it. The P-51 Mustang. Even before seeing them, Knoke knew the Mustangs would be there. The Luftwaffe's intelligence units had already warned that the Americans were pushing deeper into Germany, with fighter escorts capable of accompanying the bombers all the way to their targets and back again. This meant one thing. Attacking the bombers was no longer a simple matter of breaking through their gunfire. Now the Germans had to fight their way through swarms of escorts before they could even reach the vulnerable formations. Still, Heinz pushed forward, adjusting his oxygen mask and tightening his grip on the control column as the sky filled with more and more aircraft. All around him, other fighters from his group formed up, each pilot glancing nervously at the massive force ahead. Some were veterans like him. Others were barely 20 years old, new recruits who had only a handful of missions behind them. Many of those pilots would not survive the day. As the formations converged, Heinz's radio crackled with the voice of his squadron leader, ordering them to prepare for attack. He felt his heart beat slow, his breathing steady. In moments like this, he had learned to focus on a single idea, survive long enough to make the mission count. The first pass at the bombers would be the most dangerous. Closing in head-on was the only way to maximize the chances of inflicting damage while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. But it required nerves of steel. The defensive guns of the lead bombers would open up long before he reached firing distance. The sky would become a tunnel of red and white tracers, each one capable of tearing through his aircraft or ripping off a wing. He checked his instruments, his ammunition, the pitch of his engine. Everything was in order. He rolled the aircraft slightly, dipping his wing to confirm the position of the rest of his squadron. Then he pushed forward, accelerating into the first attack run. The bombers began firing long before he expected. Streams of tracers arced across the sky, slicing past his canopy and hammering the air around his aircraft. He felt the Bf-109 shudder as the slipstream shook under the force of incoming rounds. He pushed the nose forward, lining up on the nearest B-17. He could see the glint of its nose turret sweeping toward him, then the flash of its guns as it poured fire directly into his path. He squeezed the trigger, sending a burst from his 20mm cannon at the lead bomber. His rounds tore into the aircraft's forward fuselage, shattering glass and sending fragments spiraling away. For a split second, he thought he had scored a kill, but the bomber held formation, refusing to break away. More defensive guns swung toward him. He felt the impact of a near hit on his left wing and yanked the control stick back, forcing his fighter into a steep climb to avoid being shredded. As he leveled out, gasping for breath, he heard frantic voices on the radio. One of the new pilots had been hit on the first pass. Another reported smoke coming from his engine. A third screamed a warning as a group of P-47s dove toward the German formation from above. Heinz twisted sharply, forcing his aircraft into a spiraling turn just as the American fighters streaked past. Their guns flashed in brilliant sparks, stitching lines of bullets across the sky. One German fighter exploded into flames, falling in a twisting arc toward the ground. Another spiraled out of control, trailing smoke. In seconds, the escorts had turned the Luftwaffe's formation into chaos. This was the new reality of the air war. The Germans could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. Every attack was met by overwhelming numbers, overwhelming firepower, overwhelming coordination. As he regained altitude, Heinz realized something that tightened his chest more than fear ever could. The Americans were not simply flying missions. They were erasing Germany's ability to defend itself. More bombers appeared behind the first wave. Then more behind them. The horizon was filled with aircraft, each one part of an unstoppable chain stretching back toward the English coast. Heinz had never seen anything like it. No one in the Luftwaffe had. The war, he realized, had changed forever. And deep down, he knew something else as well. Germany could not win a war fought like this. He banked hard, pulling away from a cluster of P-51s that had locked onto him. His fuel was running low, his ammunition nearly gone, and the bombers still filled the sky. He could see bombs dropping from the first formation, falling like black specks toward the factories and towns below. Smoke began rising from the ground as explosions rippled across the landscape. He circled once, twice, watching helplessly as the American formations continued their unbroken advance. There were too many of them, far too many. Even if he destroyed one bomber, 10 more would take its place. If he shot down one fighter, the sky would still be full of others. It was in that moment, staring at the endless chain of aircraft stretching from horizon to horizon, that Heinz Knoke felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. The war was lost, not because he doubted his own skill, not because he feared the enemy, but because the scale of American power had become undeniable. Germany no longer controlled its own skies. The Luftwaffe was being outnumbered, outbuilt, and outlasted, and no amount of courage or sacrifice could change that. He turned his aircraft toward home, the distant sound of bombs echoing behind him, knowing that tomorrow the sky would look exactly the same, and the day after, and the day after that. The engines of Heinz Knoke's Messerschmitt droned steadily as he approached the airfield, but his mind was still trapped in the sky he had just escaped. Even as he lowered the landing gear and felt the wheels thump onto the frozen runway, the image of that endless chain of American bombers burned in his thoughts. The young ground crews ran toward his aircraft as it rolled to a stop, searching for bullet holes and fuel leaks, but Heinz barely heard them. He climbed out of the cockpit slowly, removing his gloves with mechanical motions, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. He knew that the war on the ground would continue for months, perhaps years. But the war in the air, his war, was slipping away. Every pilot returning from that mission had the same hollow expression in their eyes. The Luftwaffe had lost good men that day, some still in flames in the forests below, others prisoners in Allied hands, and many more simply missing. Yet the bombers had continued on, as if the German fighters were nothing more than an inconvenience. Inside the briefing hut, the air smelled of sweat, fuel, and fear. Officers moved between tables, marking losses on maps, trying to hide the growing panic in their faces. Heinz stood silently in one corner as the group commander delivered the numbers. Aircraft lost, pilots killed, missions failed, factories destroyed. But no statistic could capture what Heinz had seen with his own eyes. Germany was no longer fighting a balanced war. It was being crushed by the weight of industrial power far beyond anything it could match. That night, Heinz wrote in his diary, as he often did. But the words came slower than usual. He described the massive formations, the endless escorts, the hopelessness that spread through the pilots as they realized they were being asked to stop something that could not be stopped. He wrote of the new recruits who had taken off that morning full of nervous excitement and had never returned. He wondered how long it would take before every German city lay in ruins, before every pilot was gone, before the sky belonged entirely to the Americans. The next morning brought no relief. Before dawn, the ground crews awoke the pilots with the now familiar urgency. Another wave of bombers was approaching, the same drill, the same climb, the same dread. Heinz strapped himself into his aircraft once more, though every instinct in his body told him that the fight ahead was beyond human endurance. But duty, pride, and the unspoken bond among pilots pushed him back into the sky. This time, as his group approached the incoming bombers, they encountered the American escorts even earlier than before. The P-51 Mustangs cut through the clouds with ease, flying in disciplined formations that reminded Heinz of the early days of the war, back when the Luftwaffe had been the elite force, when German pilots had dominated the skies with confidence and precision. Now the roles were reversed. The American fighters moved like hunters who had already studied their prey. They knew the Luftwaffe was short on fuel, short on ammunition, and short on experienced pilots. Every new German fighter that climbed into the air was met by a swarm of Mustangs diving from above, using their superior speed, altitude, and numbers to control every engagement. Heinz fired bursts at two Mustangs that crossed his path, but neither broke formation. They stayed coordinated, disciplined, unshaken. Within minutes, German fighters were falling around him. Some spiraled into the clouds, trailing smoke. Others exploded mid-air as their fuel tanks ignited. A few dove for the ground in desperate attempts to escape, though many never made it. Heinz managed to break away and climb higher, trying to find an angle from which he could attack the bombers. But once again, the sky ahead was filled with steel. The massive aircraft was so large that it created its own weather, disturbing air currents, casting immense shadows on the ground far below. Dozens of German fighters attempted to regroup for a head-on attack, but the escorting Mustangs immediately closed in, scattering them before they could reach firing distance. Still, Heinz pushed forward. He lined up on a B-24 from the trailing group, squeezed the trigger, and watched his cannon shells impact the bomber's fuselage. For a moment, it looked as though the aircraft might be forced out of formation, but then the bomber's gunners retaliated. A hail of .50 caliber rounds tore through the air around him, one striking the underside of his left wing, another shattering part of his canopy. He yanked the stick sharply, diving away as the airframe trembled violently. His breathing became ragged inside the oxygen mask. He knew he was running out of time. The fuel gauge dropped dangerously low, yet the bombers still filled the sky, unbroken, undeterred, unwavering. Once again, he had made no difference. Once again, the Americans kept coming. Heinz turned toward home, ascending through a layer of thin clouds to avoid the pursuing Mustangs. But even there, he found no comfort. Through the mist, he could still hear the distant engines of the bomber stream. They sounded calm, steady, assured. They were not just machines. They were the voice of an overwhelming industrial force delivering a message to Germany. Resistance was futile. When Heinz landed, the airfield was quieter than the day before. Too many aircraft were missing. Too many pilots' bunks would remain empty that night. The mechanics worked silently, avoiding the pilots' eyes. They knew what the numbers meant. They knew they were watching the gradual destruction of the Luftwaffe, one mission at a time. A few hours later, as Heinz walked past the command hut, he overheard two senior officers whispering. They spoke in clipped voices, careful not to be overheard. One of them said what Heinz had already accepted. If this continues another month, we will have no fighters left. And yet, the missions continued. Every day, new formations entered German airspace. Every day, the Luftwaffe tried to intercept them, and every day, the losses mounted. Germany was losing fuel, pilots, aircraft, cities, factories, hope. The war had become a slow-motion collapse, one measured not in territory lost, but in lives and machines thrown into a fight that could not be won. In the weeks that followed, Heinz watched the Luftwaffe fracture into fragments. Where there had once been entire wings of fighters, now there were scattered groups. 10 aircraft here, 6 there, sometimes only 2. The American formations remained massive, disciplined, unstoppable. Even when the Germans managed to shoot down a bomber, it changed nothing. Production lines in the United States simply replaced it. New pilots arrived, new machines rolled out. The Allied air forces grew stronger with every month. Heinz wrote in his diary again, this time with grim honesty. He described the despair spreading among the pilots, the hopelessness in their eyes, the feeling that they were being sacrificed for no reason other than pride. He wrote of standing beside the wreckage of a friend's burned-out fighter, of pulling a flight roster from a board and realizing that more names were crossed out than remained. He wrote that the Luftwaffe was falling apart, and everyone knew it. Then came the mission that changed everything. It was a bitterly cold morning, the kind where frost clung to every metal surface and pilots struggled to breathe in the freezing air. Heinz was leading a small group of fighters, just 9 aircraft, when the radar stations reported another incoming formation. But this time, the numbers were beyond anything recorded before. Nearly 1,000 American bombers were approaching, escorted by hundreds of fighters. It was the largest single air assault Germany had ever faced. As Heinz climbed and broke through the cloud layer, he felt his breath leave him. The sky was blackened by aircraft. Bombers stretched across the horizon, row after row, altitude upon altitude, a metal wave rolling toward the heart of Germany. Their escorts circled above and beside them like predators guarding a herd. The sun reflected off their wings in blinding flashes, turning the entire sky into a battlefield of light and shadow. Heinz did not attack immediately. He could not. He simply stared, his aircraft drifting, his hands frozen on the controls. He had thought he had seen massive formations before, but this was a force of nature. This was industrial war at its peak. This was the moment when he understood, with absolute clarity, that the Luftwaffe was fighting the impossible. The radio crackled with orders to attack, but even the officers' voices trembled. The German fighters charged, firing bursts, scattering in every direction, but their efforts disappeared into the vastness of the American armada. Heinz made a single attack run, firing into a group of B-17s, watching as one engine burst into flames. The bomber fell away, spiraling slowly, but it did not matter. The formation filled the gap instantly, continuing forward without hesitation. Moments later, the escorts were upon him. A pair of Mustangs closed in, their silver fuselages gleaming in the sunlight. He dove, then climbed, then rolled, trying to escape, but they stayed glued to his tail. Their discipline was unbreakable, their maneuvers sharp and calculated. He fired a desperate burst behind him, then plunged into a cloud, hoping to lose them. It worked, but barely. When he emerged, the sky ahead was still full of bombers. He knew then that he could not continue the fight. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. He turned back toward the airfield, flying low to conserve what little fuel remained. As he approached the runway, smoke rose in the distance. Bombs had already fallen on a nearby town. By the time he touched down, the bombing raids still roared overhead, wave after wave striking deeper into Germany. That night, Heinz sat alone in the dimly lit barracks, listening to the dull echoes of anti-aircraft guns firing in the distance. He knew that the war, at least in the air, was already lost. Not because of a single mission, not because of a single defeat, but because of the sheer, unrelenting strength of the enemy. America had brought its entire industrial power into the sky, and Germany had nothing left to match it. The next morning, he spoke quietly to a young pilot who had just arrived at the base. The boy looked no older than 18. He had bright eyes, trembling hands, and the naive excitement of someone who had not yet seen the inside of a burning cockpit. Heinz looked at him and felt a heaviness he could not hide. He wanted to tell the boy the truth, that the war he was entering was already decided, that bravery alone could not change the outcome, that the Luftwaffe he dreamed of joining was already a shadow of what it once had been. But he said nothing. He simply patted the boy on the shoulder and walked away. Within a week, that young pilot was gone. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe had been shattered. Its veteran aces were dead, captured, or exhausted. Its bases were bombed, its fuel reserves nearly empty. The American raids continued with increasing intensity, and every German city felt their weight. Heinz continued flying missions when ordered, but he no longer pretended to believe they could change the course of the war. He fought because that's what he knew. Because the comrades beside him still depended on one another, because turning away would feel like betrayal. But deep inside, the truth was settled. The war was lost the moment he saw hundreds of American bombers stretching across the horizon, escorted by fighters Germany could no longer stop. In later years, he would write about that moment. About the sound of engines that seemed to shake the world, about the sunlight flashing off the wings of thousands of aircraft, about the helplessness that swept over him as he realized that no amount of courage could change what was coming. Heinz Knoke survived the war, but the Luftwaffe he had once believed in did not. And long after the gunfire fell silent, he never forgot the day he looked into the sky, saw the American armada, and understood, completely, irrevocably, that it was over.